Okay, so we're going to get going here. Um, Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the 200th anniversary of William Seward's Union graduation in 1820. My name is Noelle Marcharge, and I'm a 2005 graduate of Union College. I work in college relations, and we are excited to be hosting this event as part of our virtual 2020 Homecoming and Family Weekend celebration. Before I get into introductions, I just would like to review some housekeeping notes. I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and we will be treated to two presentations today. Each presentation will last approximately 20 minutes, and we will save the remaining 20 minutes at the end for questions. Please utilize the question or chat feature at the bottom of your screen to ask your question. And you can enter those questions throughout the course of the webinar today during the presentations as you think of those questions. And we will do our very best to get to all of your inquiries. So our first presentation will be hosted by Dr. Gustave Davis. Gus Davis is a pathologist and clinical professor at Yale University. He graduated from Union in 1959 and resides in Connecticut with his wife, Sue. Gus's interest in Seward was inspired by a 2015 trip to Alaska that coincided with the anniversary celebration of the Louisiana Purchase.
Oh, no.
Since then, Gus has hosted a series of Seward lectures and discussions. Gus, we are delighted to have you with us today. Our second presentation will feature Jeff Ludwig from the Seward House Museum. For the past 5 years, Jeff Ludwig, PhD, has been the Director of Education at the Seward House Museum in Auburn, New York. In 1951, William Henry Seward III bequeathed the family home to the Fred L. Emerson Foundation to serve as a living memorial to his famous father and grandfather. Jeff is also a professional historian with extensive experience in public history and the museum field. Jeff's colleague, Maria Coleman, has also helped make this webinar possible. Maria is the Director of Development at the Seward House Museum. Jeff and Maria, thank you for joining us today. So I will be back on the screen at the end to help moderate the questions. I also want to thank everybody for joining the webinar, thank our IT team, Michael, and now I will turn it over to Gus. Enjoy, everyone.
Oh, are we here? Am I on?
You're on, Gus.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. Welcome to fellow alum and friends from the Seward Museum and you folks out there in the ether. This is an interesting experiment for us, and it's really the first virtual homecoming that we've had. Are we moving? Here we go. Okay. In 2001, Union celebrated the bicentenary of Seward's birth with a library exhibit, art gallery exhibit, and a 3-day symposium with invited lectures. In February of 2013, Walter Starr, who was the author of an acclaimed biography of Seward, delivered Founders Day keynote address. Seward, perhaps Union College's most accomplished graduate, and other than presidents, the foremost American statesman of the 19th century, is commemorated at Union by a trolley below, which is really not the Union trolley, but I couldn't get another picture. The trolley between a rock and a hard place. Terrible pun, excuse me. At previous homecomings, I have spoken about Seward's years as Lincoln's Secretary of State and the purchase of Alaska, and his survival of serious carriage accident and assassination attempt in 1865, which resulted in paralysis of his upper extremities. But now in this 200th anniversary year of William Henry Seward's graduation from Union College, we turn to his youth, his precocity, and his experiences at Union College. In September of 1816, 15-year-old Seward, called Harry by his family and Henry by his wife Frances later, left his Florida, New York home by coach to Newburgh to take the recently invented Hudson River steamboat, ironically Clinton's folly, to Albany. Another coach ride brought him to Schenectady, then the third largest city in New York, thriving on the transfer of goods between the west via the Mohawk River and the east via Albany and the Hudson. Seward said, "I climbed the college hill with a reluctant and embarrassed step to offer myself for examination, which I feared I might not pass." He was vetted by a Reverend Macaulay, professor of mathematics and natural philosophy. He requested admission to the junior class. He was qualified, well prepped in Goshen and Florida, New York, but was rejected as he had not yet achieved the 16 years of age required by college laws. He was then duly matriculated as a sophomore, class of 1819. Intelligent, well-prepared, and ambitious, he felt a conscious self-satisfaction in being trusted to pursue his studies and govern his conduct without the surveillance of parent or teacher. He had already cherished in his secret thoughts aspirations to become, at the end of my 3 years, the valedictorian of my class. College discipline under President Dr. Knott was based on the soundest and wisest principles, but Seward could not speak so highly of the system of education. Rote memory and recitation of fragmentary tasks without continuity or completion, pretty typical of colleges at that time. During the following 2 years, Seward challenged both his fellow students and professors in his desire not merely to acquire lessons, but to understand them as well. The challenge occurred by obtaining the assistance of his Latin tutor, which was not done. At a later date, he refused to apologize to another tutor over a matter of insubordination in the classroom. He had challenged the teacher who had changed a lesson assignment and then left the school for 2 weeks before Dr. Knott resolved the matter by apologizing for the tutor in exchange for Seward's apology. In spite of his challenges to the education system, college reports of my demeanor, my study and demeanor gratified my parents and encouraged me. The only drawback was his inability to bring his expenses in line with his parental allowance. By his junior year, he had given up the idea of receiving valedictorian honors. He doubted whether they were to be desired at the expense of the isolation which the pursuit of them involved. But when the fifth national chapter of Phi Beta Kappa Society was established at Union in 1817 for members of the junior class who had excelled in scholarship, Seward felt it would be a disgrace to be left out. He and a roommate quitted the college commons, lived in our own room throughout the long period of trial in severe study, and finally entered the great society without encountering the deadly blackball. Seward made his first political speech at this time in support of Tompkins. Seward was a student bucktail, a member of the Van Buren side of a New York intra-Republican party factional feud. However, in spite of the advice of the Republican students at Union College, DeWitt Clinton, not Tompkins, was elected governor of New York State. Then, without notice, Seward left Union College January 1st, 1819, over that previous misunderstanding with his father due to his debts to college tailors. He shipped from New York City to Savannah, Georgia, with a college classmate who had taken a position as director of a new school in rural Eatonton, Georgia, settled by emigres from New England. A month later, February 2nd, he wrote to his family from Savannah, Georgia, I have ever cultivated affection and respect for my parents, an affection and respect which, though sometimes embittered by circumstances, has ever maintained and still continues to hold the supremest situation in my heart. He then goes on to explain, for 2 collegiate sessions, my funds have been so contracted that with all the economy I am master of, I've been unable to defray my college expenses. But when my remonstrances were ever anticipated by the charge of prodigality, in silence I submitted, I considered and reconsidered, resolved and resolved, determined to remain at college. But then I had but $95 out of which I must spend For traveling to Schenectady and back, $22. For board, $26. For college bill, which had necessarily increased and which on penalty of your displeasure, I was commanded to pay $57. For wood and candles, washing at least $15, a total of $120, beside incidental expenses. So he's in the hole for $25, and said, I adopted the only measure left me and determined to accept the offer which I had received of $400 per year as assistant in teaching a classical school in the interior of this state. He's writing from Savannah. Thus, throwing myself upon the broad world for subsistence, I was aware of the opinion of the world would form of me. Vagabond and prodigal must be the character I would sustain. I well knew I suspended so near the termination of my college course that I forfeited my right to expect assistance and support from my parents. However, he said, if I succeed in gaining my school, I shall prosecute with all diligence my collegiate study, and I trust, though I shall be unable to attend the commencement, still that I shall be able to receive my degree at the same time. If my business be sufficiently lucrative, I shall as soon as possible commence the study of law, and with such diligence prosecute it as my practice will not disgrace my parents or myself. Immediately upon my arrival at my destination, I shall inform you where, if I have not forfeited all your solicitude. Your advice will still comfort and assist, dear father and mother, your, through necessity, undutiful son, William H. Seward. En route, the schoolmate contracted for employment in the more prestigious Augusta Academy, leaving Seward to continue to Eatonton, where, vetted by the trustees of the new school, he was hired to assume the charge of the new institution they have founded. The Midville Journal reporting on this advertisement did appear in a New York newspaper and was seen by his father. In the journal, it states, the rector, the head of school, Mr. William H. Seward, is late from Union College, New York, from which institution he comes highly recommended as a young gentleman of good moral character and distinguished industry and literary acquirements. He will teach Latin and Greek languages and practical mathematics, logic and rhetoric, natural and moral philosophy, chemistry, geography, English grammar, and such other branches as are commonly taught in northern colleges. This is after 2 years of college. Seward's father finally tracked him down, and as a result of a pleading letter from his mother and threats of legal action by his father, as he explains to his mother, he will return home by at least the 25th of June. In June 1819, he returns home to Florida after arranging for his replacement from another student unknown to us at Union College. During the next 6 months, as he indicated previously, he read the law at Florida and Goshen, New York. His experience in the South left him with an antipathy to barbaric slavery, but an appreciation of Southern hospitality. He then returned to Union College, joining the senior year class in January 1820. His return was embarrassing, since starting where he had left, his competitors for scholastic honors considered him a late intruder. And by those with no such aspirations, they considered him a probable leader in irregularities and insubordinations. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 caused a campus schism between students from the North and South. Prominent college affairs were secret societies, the Philomathian and the Adelphic. The Southerners joined the Philomathian, but soon left to form their own secret society, the Delphian. The initial presence of the Southerners in the Philomathian caused great agitation in the Adelphic, resulting in discussion not of slavery, but of the relative merits of Northern and Southern society. There was sympathy for the Southerners among the Adelphic leadership, but Seward, a member of the Adelphic, promptly decided that the Southern secession was unjustifiable and disloyal to the institution, I assume Union College, if not the Adelphics, and the country. This brought him in direct conflict with the recognized leaders of the Adelphic, who indicted him and arraigned him for some offense against the society, the punishment being expulsion. He spoke in his own defense and was triumphantly acquitted, then selected as one of the 3 Adelphic speakers, class manager, and recipient of the highest honors at commencement. He said, "A review of this day of the experience of this, my last term at college, leaves me in doubt upon the question of precocity. My chief work in the Literary Society was an essay on the Erie Canal. Again, Clinton's ditch now. That Clinton's ditch was an impossibility and would financially ruin the state. After all, he was a bucktail and anti-Clinton." Commencement, July 11th, was signified by an open feud between the Adelphians, now the Southerners, and the combined Philomathians Adelphics, no, the Northern Party. He stated the class was separated on the stage, and I think it was not until 30 years afterward that I received a kind recognition for any one of the seceders. The subject of his commencement oration was the integrity of the American Union. Starr, in his biography, it's 2012, notes in a reference to his quotes from the oration, Abraham Lincoln Collection, Yale. Seward also notes that Seward's oration has not been noticed by prior biographers. I took the lead and located the manuscript in the Yale Beinecke Library and obtained permission to examine it and photocopy it. Seward's handwriting, even before his 1865 injuries to his right arm, is difficult to interpret. I believe I've made an accurate transcription, and the following is likely the first public reading appearance, other than Starr's quotes, of the oration since its premiere, July 11th, 1820. Oration on the probable permanency of the Union. Here is the first page, and this is a true photocopy of his diploma, which hangs in his study at the Seward House in Albany. It opens with a flowery introductory homage to the fallen heroes of the Revolution, probably a standard for students of rhetoric. I won't read it, but we'll move on to the next paragraph, in which he states, "The enthusiasm with which you recently hailed another return of the anniversary of American liberty, July 4th, the oration was given on July 11th, while it evinces your high estimation of these blessings of liberty, evinces also that their continuation is the subject of no ordinary interest. I therefore solicit the attention of this respected audience to a brief train of reasoning in support of this position, that the American Union will probably be permanent." He then mourns the death of other republics of the past, again in flowery language, and goes on to state, to guard against the probable danger from a foreign force, it is the unrivaled perfection of the American Constitution to embrace in harmonious union those pacific principles which conciliate the friendship of surrounding nations and those energetic principles which repel the assault of the invader. Here, agriculture and eloquence and genius in the white robes of peace minister at the altars of wealth, of honor, of science. Here, legislation wears the gown of citizenship, and even war is clad in the habiliments of husbandry, the clothes of the common people. This is the genius of our Constitution inclined to peace. But though in ordinary circumstances, neutrality is the safeguard of national independence, such is the malignity of national avarice and ambition that the freeborn sons and daughters of Columbia, even when banqueting under the banner of peace, may be roused from their festivity by the trumpet's clangor or the war whoop's rampart. Yet in them they excite no apprehensions, for they are defended by a rampart more substantial and more secure than even that of justice itself. The ability of a nation to resist invasion embraces the extent of its resources and the power of the government to direct them. Stranger, do you demand the resources of America? Survey those widely extended harvests, which rapidly rolling towards the west have already surmounted the lofty Allegheny and now glitter on the banks of the Mississippi. The west at that time, for Seward, was to the Mississippi River. How vast the wealth of our empire when civilized man shall complete the conquest he has already commenced, and wrested from the savage panther and the bear and the still more savage aborigines, wrested from the still more savage aborigines, the dominion annexed to his title as Lord of Creation, clearly manifest destiny. Now turn to the shores of the Atlantic. See those 1,000 manufactories rise obedient to the command of a wise and liberal policy. Those sails are but the precursor of a commerce whose 1,000 sails shall waft to every clime the productions of our garden for the consumption of a world. Truly a global economy. The power to direct these resources is fully and absolutely vested in the general government, which so far as it relates to war or peace is an entire consolidation of the powers of the nation, for it appeals not to the individual states, but imposes its imperious mandate on the private citizens, we the people. Rejoice that our history, though short, has already established my theory. Contemporary with the commencement of our national existence commenced the most awful revolution ever experienced in history. I believe he refers to the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. The whole continent of Europe became one vast field of misery. And now, when the last temple of liberty yet remaining is subverted, referring to Switzerland as a republic, these legions of desolation and death directed their attacks against the bulwarks of American neutrality, the XYZ affair, and then the War of 1812. But the alarm once sounded, the sons of liberty arose, and amid the thunders of insulted independence, drove them back to the fields of their licensed dominion, to Europe. But now we pass to the probability of, I can't read that. Sorry. But now we pass to the possibility of internal danger, and first from a revolution of interest in the several states. Some argue a difference of interest between the northern and southern states would result in this danger. Situated along the same coast, pursuing the same objects, speaking the same language, and governed by the same principles, no difference of interest has yet arisen. To the heroes who fell at Charleston and Saratoga, the War of Independence, and those in later days fell upon the plains of Bridgewater and New Orleans, War of 1812, for their valor in the same glorious cause, has their admiring country awarded them the laurel. For their death in the same glorious cause, in tears, she has interwoven with the same cypress. To the system of slavery in the South might create a diversity of interest. But gradual emancipation, the true policy of those states, is also the policy worthy of the encouragement of northern states. For though small is the number of slaves, yet the fact is glaring that we have assisted, all too industriously assisted, to impose on the Negro spirit those mountains of oppression under which he now labors. Should this Titan ever burst from his confinement, we, whether connected or separate, should not escape unhurt in that tremendous cataclysm which would shake the South to its center. But this danger, together with that so often repeated of a difference of agriculture and commercial interest, is rendered visionary by the accession of our immense Western territory. So let us then cultivate a community of interest and thus give solidity to its foundation. Let us cultivate a community of character and thus decorate its superstructure with the magnificence of natural glory. Others draw the line of separation. east and west along the Allegheny Mountains, others along the Mississippi. Now, the only imaginary advantage which could result to either section of the Union for such a division would be a nominal independence. While the eastern states, it would lose a participation in the results of Western agriculture, and to the western states, a participation in the results of eastern manufacture. To the eastern states, it would secure the desolation of their frontier by an army, which has already conquered the hitherto invincible conquerors of Bonaparte, Britain. And to the western states, the destruction of their commerce by a navy, which has already wrung restitution from the home of domineering piracy, and the scepter from the hand of the mistress of the ocean, Great Britain. So he's referring to the army and navy of the existing undivided United States, which would then become a threat to the separate eastern and western states. From the dangers usually of individual ambition, we're well secured. Here, individual ambition, the ascent of honors is long, laborious, and thronged with sentinels which proclaim every aberration from virtue. Here, ambition can lead to the march of no standing army to desolate, and ride in the whirlwind of no superstitious ignorance, I wish it was true today, to blast the fruits of freedom. From the division of ranks, we too are free. For though the favors of fortune be unequally distributed, and the family may arise amid splendors of wealth and honors, a family may also sit among the clouds of poverty and disgrace. The danger from local parties is prevented by the peculiar circumstances of our population. Ours is and will long remain a land of emigration. The inhabitants of the different sections bearing with them the same feelings, affections, and character will worship the same God and answer the same laws, whether on the banks of the Hudson, the Mobile, or the Missouri. Such are the arguments which induce I can't read that actually. That though the substance to the general nature pressed on all human institutions, yet that such are the arguments, or that no immediate and extraordinary cause is operating to produce the dissolution of our union. Happy, thrice happy, ye freeborn sons and daughters of Columbia, for your destiny is in our hands. But now Seward kind of changes, and his last paragraph reads, "Oh, may you ever remember that luxury is the only serpent admitted into this paradise of liberty." College, country, that the day on which you taste the fruit he offers, the serpent, your expulsion is certain, and all re-entrance into these gates is forever cut off by the flaming sword which is waved by the cherubim of justice. And he ends with a finish. Seward's political credo might be summarized as the Union, as in the exemplar of which is the Constitution, abolition, gradual emancipation, and emigration, manifest destiny, Western expansion, world trade. He was against slavery, and ironically, his family in Florida and New York owned slaves, and slavery was not outlawed in New York State till 1827. But he was willing to compromise legislation against it to preserve the Union and the Constitution. The growth of agriculture, invention, commerce, immigration, and American expansion would ultimately result in the demise of slavery, thus preserving the Union. Western expansion would be accomplished at the expense of the still more savage Aborigines. In 1820, he stated that no immediate and extraordinary cause is operating to produce the dissolution of our Union, but should this Titan ever burst from this confinement, whether connected or separate, we should not escape unhurt in that tremendous convulsion which would shake the South to its center. In spite of his doubt regarding his own precocity, his graduation oration presages the words and thoughts in his major speeches given 30 years later. particularly his Corinthian Hall, Rochester Speak, October 1858, where he spoke of slavery and free labor as an irrepressible conflict in a speech that likely cost him the presidency. But the oration ended on that more personal appeal, mea culpa, my fault, and a warning to his fellow graduates. Oh, may you ever remember that luxury. Luxury is something adding to the pleasure or comfort, but not absolutely necessary, is the only serpent admitted into this paradise of liberty, that the day on which you taste the fruit he offers, your expulsion is certain, and all re-entrance into the gates is forever cut off by the flaming sword which is waved by the cherubim of justice. Taken from Genesis 3:24. He drove out the man at the east gate of the Garden of Eden and placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life, the tree of knowledge. A warning and apology by the self-described vagabond who travels from place to place without a visible means of support, and the prodigal who indulges in luxurious living. I was aware of the opinion the world would form of me, vagabond and prodigal, must be the character I should sustain, and I well knew I was suspended so near its termination, my college course, that I forfeited my right to expect assistance from my parents. Young and smart, precocious, independent, confrontational, principled, ambitious, bribed, and pompous, some of the many words we could use to describe the young Seward. Seward is memorialized at Union as a result of great work by the class of 2000 and cousins Duncan and Cal Query, by a rock on Seward Place, the Tubman statue at the Schenectady Library, and ironically more interesting because in this politically correct era, there is a petition to tear down the 2016 statue of Seward in Juneau, Alaska, honoring the Alaska Purchase, because he represents, white patriarchal authority and the disenfranchisement of Alaska natives. The natives didn't sell their land to the US, and that wrong has never been corrected. He embodied the manifest destiny. His imperialistic vision was founded on white supremacy. And more recently, there was an attempt to tear down a statue of Abraham Lincoln because he also represents white patriarchal authority in regard to Native Americans. He was an imperfect figure, said the sculptor, but his legacy in Alaska is important. Here's a bust and diploma replica we hope to present to Union College. Maybe, hopefully, we have a May 2021 election, thanks to the prodding of Professor Emeritus Frank Wicks. Here is a photograph of the Union seal attached to his diploma, and as he is written in the final page of his manuscript, finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gus, for sharing all that incredible information, insight, and history with us. We really appreciate it. And now we are going to turn it over to Jeff at the Seward House Museum.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Noelle, and Gus as well. It really can't be understated, the work you did to find that document in the archives at Yale and to transcribe it. It's a gift I think we'll keep giving for years, as scholars can now have easy access to it and begin to parse the words that you shared with us. And probably the first reading in over 200 years now. I wanted to spend a little more time unpacking that, and in so doing, unpack some more of the various arcs of Seward's career. One of the things I think is quite remarkable about the oration from the commencement of July of 1820 is the way it anticipates so much of Seward's career and legacy. And those of us watching today, many of you are Union College alums, or you're watching this because you're a friend of the Seward House Museum. Think back to when you were 19. Imagine how unformed you still were, how much there was still to be shaped in your mind, your ideals, your values, your principles. What political philosophies and perhaps faction party would you align yourself with, subscribe to? For Seward, he seemed to have quite a lot figured out. He would ship parties, of course, not remain a bucktail. But I think it's incredible that this document produced by Seward at 19, we can cast forward from it to see how much of this oration has threads that continue through all the years of Seward's career. I also think the Union College experience that Seward had provides us an excellent opportunity to look at the way Seward viewed education in general. I want to begin by doing that and talk about the ways that Seward, over a 40-year career in public life that would see him about a decade after his graduation enter the arena, 29, 10 years older than he was at 19, becoming a state senator, then a two-term New York governor, US senator, Secretary of State after missing the presidency. Gus has set us up really nicely to discuss these chapters of his career. And throughout the offices he held throughout his near half century in public life, he was a promoter of a certain view of education. And I want to suggest to you today that it's sort of a twofold view, and about half of it, the one side of the coin, is a direct response to the way he valued and appreciated the experience he received during his time at Union. And on the other hand, a sort of a rejection, a regret that Union College offered him an education, as Gus has already told us, that was grounded in what he considered an outmoded curriculum that prioritized rote learning, recitation, and memorization for its own sake, and that wasn't lingering, didn't build up to anything bigger than the sum of its parts. The title of my talk is The Threshold of National Politics. I'll explain what that means in a moment. And thank you to Gus for sharing this image of the diploma with me. We do have the original here at the museum, 33 South Street in Auburn, New York. We're open, so we hope you'll come and visit us when you can. So this line, right on the eve of the commencement, Seward writes, thus, at that early day before my educational course was ended, I stood upon the threshold of national politics. He's referring to his role in this dispute between the Northern and Southern societies on campus. It's a nice image I found of the campus. I think Gus can correct me here, the 1813 design for the campus at Schenectady that would have been familiar to Seward. An apolitical political education, political in the sense that he was beginning to already see the debates and divides, and he writes about these in the oration, he talks about them, that will render North from South, that will challenge the threat of union, not the college, but of the Union of the United States. So in one sense, though through no active part on Union's curriculum, he does get a political grounding during his time on campus, and his time away, his trip to Georgia. He does not really find himself awakening to political sensibility as a student on campus. He writes in his autobiography, there was an absence of everything inquisitorial or suspicious. A very young man, which he was, had his appointed studies, recitations, attendance at prayers, and a demeanor was required that he should not disturb the quiet or order of the institution. Don't shake things up on campus. So much was committed mechanically to memory, much was forgotten as soon as it was learned. The error, if it be one, is, I suppose, incidental to our general system of education. Okay, the two sides of the coin. On the one hand, Seward received a rigorous grounding in a classical curriculum at Union. Not everything that was studied and memorized was forgotten, whether it was in those strenuous sessions while he was trying to attain honors, or in the course of an ambitious young man with an appetite for deep and voracious reading and research. Seward began to whet an appetite at Union College that would be lifelong, an appreciation and a value of learning for its own sake. Knowledge was a good thing to have for the well-rounded individual, let alone someone who had an interest in leaving an imprint on the world. So starting at Union, Seward develops strong reading habits, an appetite for intellectual work. He's certainly capable of waking up at 3 in the morning and spending hours in severe study. An appreciation for philosophy, literature, a gift for the pen, a great writer. We can see some of Seward's books here. Towards the end of his life, as one of his critics noted, Seward's collected corpus of speeches, dispatches, and books were creditable to the physical vigor of composition and his love of scholastic dialectics. Credit Union College for a lot of that literary output. He certainly owes it to Union College that he develops the patience and the virtues of a scholar and an appreciation for the life of the mind. he would put these to work, becomes governor of New York, elected in 1838. And on his inauguration day, he tips his hand, the role he's going to let education play in his administration. Education, he declares, banishes the distinctions oldest time of rich and poor, master and slave. It banishes ignorance and lays axe to the root of crime. We can see here a school district library set. As governor of New York, Seward commissions 11,000 libraries like this to be distributed across the state, across all geographic and social and economic and religious and ethnic lines, giving access, proximity to the things of learning, which is what Union gave him, would allow any student to try to rise up by their own merit and bootstraps, immerse themselves like Seward had done, and begin to open up the life of the mind. Seward makes his own contributions through his own career. He prioritized, as he would do at Union, gathering, cataloging, distributing raw data and information for broader study. Such was his commitment to conducting natural history surveys in New York, that these surveys were called the Seward surveys. Information for its own sake was no vice. A great and prodigious writer. He writes a biography of John Quincy Adams, a book about travels, a book very similar to Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the States of Virginia. It's Notes on the States of New York. He writes this while governor, doing it during breaks in the legislative session. He used the information being pumped out by surveys and the libraries being built for his school, centralizing knowledge and allowing the flow of learning to flower. And he's hoping to spread books, ideas, knowledge, and content like this broadly and diffusely across New York State, and taking the time, much as he did as a student at Union, to compose, to reflect, to analyze, and to share his own academic, intellectual perceptions with others broadly. But the other side of the coin, information simply gathered and stockpiled wasn't enough. It had to be leading to something. And this is where he felt Union failed him, and where he could reform education to imbue a deeper meaning to it. Becoming a governor and senator, he had a firsthand view and was, in fact, an active participant in the growth of the Republic. And it became very important to him that education was universal and not just a Union College model of education with knowledge for its own sake, but an education that would create a virtuous citizenry capable of responsibly inheriting this experiment in Republican democracy. He writes as a senator in 1853 that the nation was entering a career of wealth, power, and expansion. In that career, it is manifest that we shall need higher intellectual attainments and greater virtue as a nation than we have hitherto possessed. If we disappoint these expectations and acknowledge ourselves unequal to them, then how shall it be made to appear that freedom is better than slavery, republicanism more conducive to the welfare of mankind than despotism? Now, he wasn't saying in this speech at the opening, christening of a new college in Ohio, Capital University, that he wanted to set a hard, fast, and rigid curriculum core standard. He says, I will not attempt to specify at large what the university ought to teach, but it must imbue the national mind with correct convictions of the greatness and excellence to which it ought to aspire. Education to produce virtue. To do this, it must accustom the public mind to look beyond the mere temporary consequences of actions and events to their ultimate influence on the direction of the Republic, to enable men to decide, and here we see Gus's patriarchy, to enable men to decide between prejudice and reason, expediency and duty, the demagogue and the statesman, the bigot and the Christian. Education was leading somewhere, sharpened minds, a citizenry that was awake and alert to the dangers that lay in all the possibility of this new republic, to make themselves worthy of it, to resist any corruptions to that democracy. The greatest safeguard to the protection of this country were well-rounded educations, like those provided by Union College today, a liberal arts school that is raising the next generation of informed, critical thinking, independent young men and women who are going to inherit this country just like Seward was doing in 1820. And he hoped would do so with the best interest of the country at heart, setting aside things that were selfish or easy or petty, doing the harder work of duty and making a country worthy of its name. This zest for knowledge and using it effectively never wavers. As Secretary of State to President Lincoln, he creates the Foreign Relations of the United States series for the State Department. It remains in effect today. the longest running public diplomacy program in US history, the most productive documentary history program in the world. Just like as governor and as a senator before that, Secretary of State Seward is stockpiling information, making it public, and trying to disseminate it to an American public during a civil war, the Titan unleashed, that would allow them to draw their own conclusions, to be informed, to be engaged, to connect, and to use the power inherent to citizens in a democracy who get to choose their leaders and shape the direction of this country, to do so in as virtuous a way as possible. That was the promise of education for Seward, not fully delivered by Union, but I think it is now. And again, a shout out to Gus for sharing this with us, for finding this, for reading the oration. Here's a zoomed in copy of what Dr. Davis has read to us already. I want to unpack just a few lines from it to suggest to you why I think Seward is worthy of being remembered at this bicentennial of his graduation, why I think it's fair, as Professor Wicks and his friends want to commemorate and memorialize him on campus, despite the fact that, as Gus told us, it's a complicated legacy. It's not perfect. And even the oration suggests there are some antiquated notions in his thinking that need to be reckoned with and admitted as ugly to our 21st century sensibilities. But he says the American Union will probably be permanent. And it is Seward who plays a leading part. We can see Lincoln here at the Gettysburg Address, Seward behind him to his left. William Henry Seward was a part of nearly every national debate during the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and he makes preserving Union his utmost priority. After being defeated by Lincoln for the Republican nomination in 1860, he becomes Lincoln's Secretary of State. He will eventually abandon his beloved Republican Party to become a Union man. He says he'll wear no party's label again. The most important thing for this country is to preserve this Union. And as Secretary of State, he is by Lincoln's side through 4 years of war, 750,000 American lives lost. And the ultimate objective for Seward and Lincoln is not initially ending slavery, it's preserving Union. They'll get to the Emancipation Proclamation. And slavery, of course, is always the leading cause of this war. And for Seward, its final resolution, its abolition, a wonderful effect. But for Seward, throughout the 1850s, even as he's agitating against slavery through speeches like his irrepressible conflict speech in Rochester in 1858, he didn't want to allow the bonds of union to fade just because he thought that the Southern section within slavery needed to be redeemed and reformed. He wanted to effect a policy of emancipation. At times, he comes very close to being an abolitionist, but to keep the bonds of union tight, no matter what, no matter the crisis. And you can see him doing this at Union. When Seward, who has gone to Georgia, is asked by both societies to weigh in, to be their intermediary, who can speak to Northerners and Southerners alike, to try to preserve those boys on that stage, who he says will not meet again for 30 years, not even a kind word between them. In the oration, he discusses the unrivaled perfection of the American Constitution. Now, not everything Seward says that day, 30, 40 years before he's at the height of his powers, is prophetic. In fact, in 1850, Seward questions the sanctity of the Constitution in a sense. We're looking at a Supreme Court nomination process right now, and I'm having conversations about strict interpretations and originalist views, loose interpretations. For Seward, I think it's fair to say that he has a sense that the Constitution was very much a living document. And how do I know that? Well, he says during debates about the Compromise of 1850 and a new Fugitive Slave Act that he aspires to a higher moral imperative. These are a higher law than the Constitution, laws of a higher power than mankind, given governance of this republic for now, to do even better than the framers and founders. And Seward himself would largely be responsible, and as Secretary of State actually officially does the act of amending the Constitution with some of the most important amendments in that document. The 13th, the 14th, and the 15th comes just after his retirement. The 13th, of course, ending slavery. The 14th, a civil rights amendment protecting the basic citizenship rights of men, at least. It would be a while for the 19th Amendment, regardless of race. So here we see Seward actually questioning this unrivaled perfection, but it's a document that he certainly believed over time could be perfected and should be perfected as times and values and mores change. In the oration, he writes that the general government is an entire consolidation of the powers of the nation. And that speaks to his political philosophies that were developing. He would abandon the bucktail party, become a Whig and a Republican. And for Seward, in the 1830s to the 1860s, that meant being the party of a reforming activist government. He believed it fell to the collective, all of us, our resources and best intentions pooled together to do that which, in a Jacksonian moment, private interest alone would not do. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were indeed rights, but left to their own devices, people might not choose virtue. They might choose what was easy. Who would build schools and libraries, bridges, canals, and railroads? Private interest might do it if there was a profit to be had, but it took a collective action to do work that was hard, to truly reform society, to take on issues like discrimination against genders, races, creeds, religions, to end a practice like slavery. And so here we see Seward, the head of his powers, the standard bearer of the Republican Party, surrounded by men you might recognize, including a sort of beardless Lincoln there in the lower left-hand corner. But this was the political platform to which he staked himself. The government had a role to play. The system of slavery in the South and those mountains of oppression. And here we see Seward delivering a death blow to that institution. This is the so-called team of rivals, a portrait by Francis Carpenter of the Lincoln cabinet in the summer of 1862, gathered together to produce, Lincoln and Seward, both hands on the original draft, the Emancipation Proclamation, ending slavery in the rebelling territories, setting up the 13th Amendment. We can almost, if we look hard enough, look back at this oration, and if you want to, you can see this connected thread from what that young man would have said on the stage in Schenectady in 1820 to this moment in the White House. And of course, the accession of our immense Western territory. As Secretary of State, Seward does actually have a part to play in pacifism. Gus talked about how Seward had a vision for how to keep harmonious international relations. In fact, as Secretary of State, it's Seward's accomplishment, and you can read about this in the Frost series, to effect a policy of global neutrality, to keep the rest of the world out of the American Civil War, at least officially, at a time when there was a real danger. The English, the French, or other Western nations might interfere or intercede because their economies were reliant upon cheap Southern cotton, cheap because it was produced by unfree slave labor. After the Civil War, after the 13th Amendment, Seward does become an ardent believer in manifest destiny. This is the problematic aspect. It's not incorrect for people to conflate Seward with later 19th century notions of American imperialism. Seward, we know, is famous for his so-called folly, that rock on campus. I was told by Gus when we visited it last year, it was actually from Alaska. Seward purchases Alaska from Russia in the spring of 1867. Here's a painting by Emanuel Leutze, artist who's most famous for Washington Crossing, Delaware, showing the night Seward there in the State Department, March of 1867, makes the $7.2 million transaction without any buy-in or representation from the people whose lives would be swept up in this transfer on the cartography and dispossessed as a result of it. But here we see Seward becoming this proponent of expansion, just the way he describes the importance of this immense Western territory in the oration. You can certainly overdo it. You can read too much into this youthful Seward. He obviously had no way of knowing where his life would take him, that he would become a governor, a senator, a secretary of state, a statesman who would literally redraw the map of the world. But you can see in that document the buds of so much of his thinking, so much of his career. Let me just close by saying Union College remained a place that was important to Seward. The painting here to the left is on display in the president's office at Union College. To the right, former Union College president Leffelet Knott. This picture resides in the Seward House Museum in the Hall of Diplomats, men and women who were influential in Seward's life and career. Knott played a key role in Seward's upbringing. He was a father-like figure to Seward when he was a young man on that campus. And Union meant a good deal to Seward personally. He would send his second-born son, Frederick, to Union College. It was a treat. It was a gift for a member of the Seward family to be admitted to Union College, not because the college wouldn't take them necessarily, but because Seward knew that his name carried a lot of weight there. He adopted a nephew named Clarence Seward, who very badly wanted to go to Union College with Fred, but Seward was worried that Clarence might fall into bad habits. He wasn't as confident that Clarence would live up to the family name on campus, and so he sent him to a different school because the name Seward and Union College meant a great deal to him. And that story, the connection between your campus and Schenectady, the Seward House here in Auburn, still means an awful lot to us. And I'm very glad to have been able to be invited along with Dr. Davis to talk about that in some more detail. I would invite anybody who wants to learn more about Seward and to see some Union artifacts to consider planning a visit to Auburn and taking a tour and coming to learn more about this statesman, the full legacy, the good, the bad, and everything else here in Auburn, New York. And thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jeff and Gus, for everything you shared this afternoon. Now, if anybody has any questions for Jeff and Gus, you can put it right in the chat, and we can have a few minutes left for discussion here.
Are we live?
We are live.
All right. Jeff, can I speak?
Yeah.
You can.
Jeff, terrific. It's like, it's like we had the perfect handoff. I really, and I learned a lot. There's just so much here, so much information. He's such a fascinating individual. Well done.
Thank you. And really, thanks so much. The work that you've done for this oration and the transcription, it's going to mean a lot to a lot of scholars for a long time. So, and sharing the images, and it was a nice transition from the Union College experience. And I think your deep unpacking of that document lends itself well to taking a broader lens and a view of the way Seward would launch himself. He launches from Union College, and it's almost a roadmap. That oration is almost a roadmap to the 40 years that will follow.
Fascinating.
And we've got some questions here. So what did Seward do between 1920 and the time he became governor?
Would you like me to field that one? Or Gus, do you want to do it?
Well, he did read the law. You didn't, there were some law schools, but for the most part, lawyers read in another lawyer's office. So he had 6 months reading the law before he went back to Union, and he went back to read the law further after he graduated, and then spent, I believe, a year with a law firm in New York. He then looked to practice law, and he had an opportunity to go join a firm in Western New York, not a firm, a lawyer by the name of Miller. What is Miller, isn't it, Jeff? I forgot. And
Miller,
turns out that Miller had the lawyer had a daughter who was a friend of his sister. They both were classmates or schoolmates at what is now the Emma Willard Academy, or the Troy Ladies Seminary. So he not only got a practice, he got a wife. And then over the next X number of years, he practiced law in Auburn and the West. I'll pass it over to Jeff.
No, I think that sums it up pretty nicely. So the law, until a path to politics opened up, he considered running for Congress before running for the state Senate, but he and his wife were both idealistic. When you come to the Seward House Museum, you'll learn a lot about Henry, as the family here called him. But his wife was actively involved in women's rights. We have a new exhibit up for the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And of course, the home was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and his wife, Frances, was responsible for that, responsible in large part for selling to Harriet Tubman, a 7-acre farm about a mile down the road. So when you come to Auburn and during normal times and everything's open, you can plan a double visit into history where you see this museum and you go to the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park. And so we recognize that with a new exhibit on the Seward and Tubman relationships. And I think the statue, for anybody in Schenectady right now, if you've not made the trip to the library in the city, you're going to want to do that and continue to learn more about Seward, because you can sort of branch off in any number of directions. And Seward's career is alive and animated with his interest in so many areas of 19th century life and society.
Right.
Sorry, great question, Kenneth. Thank you. And we have another one here in the chat from Michael. To what extent did Seward's ideas about the curriculum have an impact on the state's educational policy?
That's a great question. So Gus mentioned Walter Starr's great biography. Recommend it strongly.
It is a wonderful book.
And so Walter writes about some of the challenges during Seward's time as governor of New York. For example, he was up against a very deeply entrenched, locally controlled school board system, especially in places like New York City. And before Seward made a name for himself, really on the national stage for his opposition to slavery, he really begins to develop a reputation for his strongly pro-immigration policies as governor of New York, welcoming especially new waves of Irish immigrants and finding them being turned away from schools in cities and townships across the state, but especially in large cities like New York. He wanted to put a stop to it. And so in addition to creating that school library system, he didn't want to just put knowledge out there, but he knew it had to do work in the world and be accessible by more than just proximity. He worked very hard, not always successfully, up against a strong, the Van Buren machine that Gus mentioned, a strong Democratic Party in New York State that resisted. Many thought that Seward as a Whig was autocratic, that his Whiggish platform that we talked about meant that he was looking to consolidate power, to invest too much power in a strong state, and they wanted to sustain local control of institutions like education. So much more successful, I think, in building libraries than necessarily centralizing New York schools under sort of a common umbrella, like we know New York schools are organized today. But he began that early work and a model to attempt to do that, to make schools standardize and follow basic rules of inclusion.
Thank you, Jeff. We've got a lot of great questions in the chat here. One from Mel, who is curious about the childhood of Seward, individual who had such confidence, intellectual ability, independence, even rebelliousness, and his interesting relationship to his parents, even to not. What kind of father was Seward?
Well, hi, Mel. It's very interesting. The relationship with his father was very difficult. His father was a very important, dominant, if not domineering individual in Florida, New York, which is, I think it's Orange County. He was a judge. He was a businessman. I'm not sure. I think he also went to medical school. He established a seminary in Florida, which still exists today as the high school, the Samuel Swayze Seward High School. He was very strict. And even as a young person, before he went off to Union, Seward was in conflict. At the same time, he respected and in his own way loved his father, but most of the loving and the support came from his mother and the women in his family and his grandmother particularly. What his role as a father, I found it difficult to assess that in my reading of him and his injuries, for example, because he, in his writing and his letters, he does not express a lot of emotion, particularly as tragedy after tragedy hits his family. I think he was a better father than he was a husband. There's no evidence that he ever strayed or had other love interests, but his relationship to his wife was fraught with great difficulty, as much as they admired each other. He spent most of his later adult life in Washington, and his children were, two of his children, Fred, of course, worked for him and the government as Secretary of State. William Jr. stayed home and ran the family. Fanny, his daughter, died tragically at age 22. She spent some time in Washington. But I don't have a good handle on his emotions other than to say he controlled them.
Thank you, Gus. And I know we're a little after one here, but we'll try and address these two questions in the chat. The next one is from Michael. How does Union or the Seward House address or grapple with the newly developing rethinking of controversial issues pertaining to the wresting the continent from savages, for example?
Well, let me say, I doubt if either institution or any of us actually knew about that until we, we read the oration. However, the issue of later in life, the issue of manifest destiny did come up. And there were people who were against it. It became a dominant theme in the late part of the 19th century. Teddy Roosevelt is an exemplar of that. And I think you have to look at the whole issue of political correctness, recognizing that every generation, there's a different correctness. And I won't go beyond that by saying I think there has to be some recognition of that people have really suffered over the years from the majority. The Bill of Rights was created to protect the minority in a majority democracy, and it has not always been adhered to. And I'll let it go with that.
I like Gus's answer an awful lot. I think the way the Seward House Museum tries to deal with aspects of Seward's legacy that are very unflattering or unfortunate to our 21st century eyes is to own it and to be honest and to try to wrestle, as I think it was Michael put it, with that openly, to not hide from it, to not try to put a coat of varnish on the fact that there are instances in Seward's career where, again, without trying to place value judgment, saying someone's on the right or the wrong side of history, that we can all agree are really, really naughty, not even morally ambiguous, but we could just feel in our bones like this isn't right. And I think we do that by having the conversation, the Seward House Museum is not in the business of Seward hagiography. It's in the business of having an open and sometimes uncomfortable conversation with visitors from all walks of life and all persuasions and all backgrounds about the complexity of history. And there are more ways than just looking at Seward and his relationship throughout a career with Native Americans, Native Alaskans. You can talk about Seward and Reconstruction, where you find his interest in racial justice flagging. I think why people continue to come back here is because we don't offer easy narratives. You're supposed to, as this conversation all about education, right? You're supposed to have these sort of critical confrontations, and that's invited here and welcomed here. And I think we try our best to be open and honest that that's the experience you'll get at the Seward House Museum.
And we'll address this final question in the chat from David, and this has some parallels to what we were just discussing. Did Seward's feelings about Aborigines evolve? Did he ever regret what manifest destiny meant to them?
Let me just, looking into the Aborigine statement, trying to come up with a rationale for it. I'll just do it from a historical point of view. Remember, from Union, which was on the frontier, Seward lived, when he was home, most of his life and actually his legal practice in New York and Western New York. Soon after the War of Independence, the Revolution, there were the General Sinclair conquered the Iroquois Confederacy in Western New York. And the land that was taken from them was given to veterans of the Revolution. People living on the frontier had a view of the Aborigines, whether they consider the Aborigines inferior or not, certainly as the enemy, because there was a significant number of them that were allies of the British during the Revolution. And I think for people that lived on the frontier and the border, their feelings about the Indies, the Native Americans, the Aborigines, was often negative. How his experience the only other experience I came across in regard to Native Americans is when in 1869, he finally went to Alaska and he had a meeting with one of the chiefs, which was, I'll use the term amiable, and the chief referred to him as the equivalent of the great white father, the great chief, and he recognized the great chief as someone who solved there was some kind of difficulty among the Aborigines and the settlers, and he looked to the great chief to solving it, and it was a positive experience. So when I saw this more recent article in the newspaper about him, I think it was less him personally and more what he represented in terms of the American experience and manifest destiny, because of course the Native Americans in Alaska didn't have anything to do with this. This was an exchange between great powers, colonial powers, as it were. Okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's it's a good answer. And this is a prime example of one of those more problematic aspects of really dealing and diving deeply into Seward's legacy. You're going to find things in there that you're going to recoil from. And notions like using offensive language, like savages, that's in there. Seward is in many ways a quintessential 19th century elite white man. And he uses the language of patriarchy. But he's also capable, this is why it's so sometimes maddening but rewarding to follow Seward through the years. He's capable of stirring oratory in terms of racial justice and social justice and color blindness. And he's capable of being callous. And I think that's probably true of all people. But for Seward, who does leave such a mark on history, it's difficult, especially when you look at his relationship with Native Americans, to sort of find constants. This is an example of, I think, of a more of a fluctuating issue with Seward, as opposed to some of the constants we've measured today. This is a great opportunity for people to read more, to engage in books like Walter Starr's biography. I will say, in general, as a member of the Whig Party, Seward was often not in favor of the Western expansion rush that was championed by the Jacksonian Democratic Party, the land grabs that displaced and dispossessed peoples in mass in the 1830s and the 1840s, yet perfectly eager to displace peoples in the Alaska Purchase. And if he'd had his way, perfectly eager as he went after territories in the Caribbean and Latin America. And this is where you get into this sort of Seward, perhaps as an early archetype of an imperialist. Usually we consider more of a late 19th century stripe of a sort of Theodore Roosevelt era. And this is maybe the danger in doing just what Gus and I have done today, in reading forward and inferring too far afield. There's plenty of complexity to get into just in unpacking Seward in his own context, in his own times.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Gus. Such a treat to have you both with us today. I learned a lot, and we appreciate it. Gus, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up?
No, what is Mel saying? Oh, thank you, Mel. Mel and I met our freshman year, October 1955, and became roommates and dear close friends ever since. Thank you very much.
And Jeff, do you have anything you want to share with the group?
Just thanks to you, Noel, and Gus, and give my best to Sue. We always love to see you. Anybody watching who hasn't been to the Seward House, plan to come. You can learn more about us on our website, sewardhouse.org. If you like this kind of conversation, we've been doing a lot of online streaming of content since the pandemic began. So you can find our Facebook page or our YouTube channel, and you could watch for hours conversations like this, presentations like this, and I hope you'll engage with us.
Great. Well, again, Gus, Jeff, Maria, Michael, and to all of our guests today, you were a great audience. We appreciate you being here. Thank you for joining us, and wish everybody a lovely fall weekend, and stay well.
Noel,
take care.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Gus.
Yes, wonderful.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.